I've seen that enabler passively try to keep that person sick so that dependency level is there. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. I wouldn't say when you start talking about denial is not that a person is lying. It's simply their inability to see something. So when you start talking about an enabler wanting this person to stay sick, I don't think that the enabler consciously wants this individual to stay sick. I think they have no clue that they need this individual to be sick. And when the individual starts to get better, then the enabler is threatened, because at that point, they don't have the same power base that they might have had, not quite as influential, don't feel needed. And then that's when they begin to struggle. But I don't think that it's something that they do intentionally. I think it's something that that they were taught. And as a result, they respond to the world that way.
Hello, this is Brandon Holt with Recovery Today magazine, aka Be a Hope Dealer. Today, I'd like to introduce an extraordinary guest. His name is Thomas Moore, who's been dealing hope for over 30 years. He has an excellent story. He's been sober for over 30 years, and he serves as a licensed chemical dependency counselor. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Thomas Moore. Thomas, how are you?
I'm doing good. How you doing today, Brandon?
Doing well. Thanks for coming on the show, Thomas.
It's my pleasure. I'm glad to be of service if I can.
So I see you have a very interesting story. You've been sober for 30 years. Take us back to the conception of when you began using drugs.
Well, I started using drugs really probably during high school. I've been drinking alcohol as long as I can remember. My dad drank and all of his friends drink. So anytime I was around them, there would always be some leftover alcohol, and they'd give us a little sip. And so that just kind of went on for years. And eventually I got to a place to where I began to drink on my own, start drinking with friends. And, we'd have little house parties, we would drink. And over time, I learned to really appreciate what alcohol was doing for me. And then later on during high school, still drinking occasionally, not a whole lot, but I was introduced to marijuana. First time did it, didn't really do anything, but later on I smoked it again, and I realized that it did have a purpose. And so after that, the rest was kind of history. Later on, started experimenting with different drugs, tried acid when I was in the Army, as well as cocaine. And so once I started doing the cocaine, everything just kind of went downhill from there.
So Thomas, were there any signs or symptoms that your family noticed in you that maybe you were trying to cover up? Because it's so common for people to they cover up drug use when not realizing that people can see behavior. So what kind of behaviors did you display that people brought to your attention?
Well, for the most part, nobody really said anything. With alcohol, it was socially acceptable. Marijuana, nobody particularly knew anything about it, so to speak. And if they did, it wasn't such a big deal. It was something that people tolerated. I was able to go to work for many years. I wouldn't necessarily call myself a functioning alcoholic, but I don't think that people really saw the extent of my usage. Over time, what happened after I was introduced to cocaine, then the symptoms became more obvious, missing work, coming home late, staying out, spending up all the money. But as far as myself is concerned, there's an element of denial. I'm inside my own skin. I'm not able to really see myself. I'm thinking I'm really looking good and fooling everybody. I really didn't think it was necessary to try to fool anybody. I thought I looked good, but I didn't see the demise coming.
So how would you define addiction? That's a two-part question. How would you define addiction? And is everyone addicted to something?
Always an interesting question. For myself, the way that I define addiction is anytime that a person is doing a substance and there are obvious negative consequences. And despite those negative consequences, a person keep going back again. And many times it doesn't matter the extent of the consequences. A person goes back over and over. When you try to explain addiction to a person who is not addicted, I generally like to use relationships. You'll see people in relationships. The relationship, excuse me, has no hope. It really, there's a bunch of negative consequences. The person is always rejecting the other person. They can't get in touch with them. But despite that, that person still continues to reach out because there's this need that's being fulfilled. So for a person who is not an addict, you have to describe it a different way. But generally, there's an insatiable desire for more of something that's not necessarily good for you.
I want to tag into something before we look at your story of hope. I noticed that through reading your bio and speaking with you in advance that you really spend a lot of time addressing codependency with your clients. And that's such a term that we use loosely. What exactly does codependency mean? How does it affect someone in their addiction? And how does it also affect someone once they become sober?
Well, when I think in terms of codependency, I always think of a description that I've always heard, and it was just a continual investment of one's own self-esteem into controlling the attitudes and behaviors of another. And the term just really made a lot of sense to me. And when I look at codependency, the person doesn't know that they're doing this. They have no idea that they're changing and shaping their perceptions and values to get someone else to, approve of them. And after a while, the person just kind of loses themselves. It's almost children who try to get their parents' attention by any means necessary. Relationship, wives, they go to extravagant extents to seek the approval of the husband and vice versa. So, with codependency, it's kind of losing oneself into this idea that really doesn't really have the ability to fill the void. And so there's just continual quest for this approval, and it never happens.
So who's usually seeking approval, the enabler or the person who's addicted?
Generally, when you start talking about codependency, it doesn't necessarily have to deal with addiction at all. It's just the individual who has some unresolved issues and believes that something outside of themselves can make them feel better. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the addicted person or, the non-addicted. Usually when you start talking about substance abuse and chemical dependency, you generally start talking about the enabler, the person who is looking to try to fix the person who has the disease of addiction. And they go to any lengths to try and fix this person. But that's just kind of something that they do.
So is there ever a time where the enabler wants to keep the addict sick so that the addict can continue depending on them and that gives them validation and self-confidence? Because we see a lot, or I hear people say, I want so-and-so to get better, I want them to get sober. But to me, I've seen that enabler passively try to keep that person sick so that dependency level is there. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. I wouldn't say when you start talking about denial is not that a person is lying. It's simply their inability to see something. So when you start talking about an enabler wanting this person to stay sick, I don't think that the enabler consciously wants this individual to stay sick. I think they have no clue that they need this individual to be sick. And when the individual starts to get better, then the enabler is threatened because at that point, they don't have the same power base that they might have had, not quite as influential, don't feel needed. And then that's when they begin to struggle. But I don't think that it's something that they do intentionally. I think it's something that that they were taught And as a result, they respond to the world that way.
So someone who's in recovery as yourself, and even as myself, when you start to grow in your sobriety, but yet you still have that enabler tugging at you, what's the solution to breaking that dysfunctional relationship?
Generally what happens is that, you know, if we've been in this, and I don't want to say the business, but in the business long enough, sometimes you can find ways of trying to explain the dynamics to another person. And if you do a really good job at kind of helping them to see using visualization, perhaps even getting them to a point to where they can look at some literature, I think getting them in a really good Al-Anon group, not one that spend time bashing the addict, but one that spend time trying to educate the codependent person about what's going on and about the dynamics, and really helping them to get healthy and learning to take care of themselves. But it will probably take somebody else other than the addict. They may not ever be able to hear the addict, but if they can go talk to another group of people who are in a similar situation, they begin to understand, in some cases, how the sickness filtered down as a result of the addiction, and in some cases, how the sickness existed long before they ever met a chemical dependent person. They may have been seeking out people who needed them so that they would be able to validate them. So it's a tricky.
Working as a therapist, do you ever see family members try to force the addict into treatment, and the addict would come into treatment because they felt pressured to come, but once the family left or they weren't around, that person would leave? What kind of share the dynamics of coming into treatment voluntarily or feeling like you've been forced into treatment? Did you experience that?
Sure. Well, when I came to treatment, by the time I got to treatment, my addiction was full blown, and I had needed a way to try to address, the addiction, generate money. And a guy talked me into writing some hot checks, so I started writing them. It worked out great. Then the time came to where it was time to pay the piper, and a lot of these checks turned into warrants. And once these checks turned into warrants, I knew I was in trouble. And I knew that if I had gone to jail, that I was going to go to the penitentiary. So I knew that I really needed to do something in good faith, because I know one day I was going to have to answer for these checks. And I knew if I had gone to treatment, then I could try and explain to a judge that I'd never written a hot check in my life, that because of the addiction, I had lost control. And by going to treatment was me putting forth a good faith effort to be able to show the course that I had tried to do something. I didn't necessarily go to get sober. I went so that I wouldn't have to go to jail, and also so that I'd be able to explain that I was trying to do something to get help. Go ahead.
I don't want to miss this key point. So you didn't go to get sober, but you went from a circumstantial situation. So
exactly.
What time did you go from feeling like it was a forced entrance into treatment to where it became voluntary and you bought into the program?
I was probably in treatment for 12 months before everything just kind of clicked. And to kind of expound on the question that you asked earlier, a lot of families try to coerce people into going to treatment, and they threaten them with, you're not going to be able to stay here, you won't be able to see your child. Wives do the same thing. I'll file for divorce if you don't go get help. Employers do the same thing. They tell people that because of the EAP program, you need to go get some help. If you don't, you're going to lose your job. So a lot of people are forced into treatment. There's this sense of urgency, and so they wind up going. And they sit in treatment, not really having a problem, blaming everybody else for them being there. And the bottom line is that they're just simply in denial. And so for myself, I went there, I was in denial. And it took a little time before I was able to understand the nature of this disease and what had actually happened. Took a little while to make sense of the demise. And it also took time to understand what they were talking about when they start talking about 12 steps, when they talk about character defects, because I didn't have any. So it took a little time. And for most people, I would think you're talking, if they have a really solid program, really sharp staff, you may be able to help people come to this awareness in maybe 60 days. I don't think a lot happens in 30 days.
So sober for over 30 years. Over 30 years you've been sober?
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
So how does faith play a part in your sobriety?
Faith is interesting. I've always been around the church, so and I'd always talked about religion and felt religious on some level. And so that was a scripture that I just never let go of. I heard the scripture and it just made all the sense in the world. And it says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not yet seen. So for me, what that meant is that just because I can't see a life being sober and having all of those things return, because I didn't see it, it didn't mean that it wasn't going to happen. And by having that faith, I was able to have the excitement and the dream and the vision to kind of come back. And I started anticipating a better life. It hasn't happened yet, but in my soul, I felt that it could.
COVID-19, Thomas, all-time high anxiety, depression, suicide rate is climbing. People are relapsing, using Dysfunctional. Someone out there tonight or during this interview could be getting ready to jump off of a bridge or commit suicide. So all of the people watching this interview, what kind of word of hope can you give that person in this moment?
You know, I would tell anybody to go talk to somebody. Things don't get that bad. It took me a long time to understand how I was interconnected to the universe and how everything that I did affected another person. And so what I would tell anybody is to pick that, 400-pound telephone up and dial 911 and call for some help. Get somewhere to where you can be nurtured, reach out to family members, call somebody that you trust, get some feedback from other people. No situation is completely hopeless. It doesn't matter what you are able to see. Sometimes if you allow other people to help you see, they can point out some things for you or to you that will really help to change the way you're looking at a situation. But definitely call and get some help. Don't believe that situation is entirely hopeless.
Thomas, we appreciate you stopping by Recovery Today magazine. You are truly a hope dealer, been dealing hope to all of those who have been struggling with substance use disorders, life issues, and we appreciate you. We honor you today. We honor all of the work that you have done. Thank you for stopping by.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me. Thank you.
Very welcome, everybody. That was Thomas Moore, licensed chemical dependency counselor. He's been sober for over 30 years, and he is now in the chemical dependency field, saving lives and dealing hope. Until next time, my name is Brandon Holt, AKA Hope Dealer. We'll see you on Recovery Today magazine.